MUNers Cross Borders 2023 Summit. I'm very happy today to be with a really fantastic crew of MUNers, both past and present. I think all of us view ourselves maybe as past our golden age, but we're still very much active in MUN, and I'm very, very happy to have them all here. So welcome everyone who's on the air meet and everyone who's watching this from across the internet. My name is Philippe. I'll be moderating today's discussion, but we have with us three great people. Bill Yotiv, who, for those of you who were on before, continues with us today from Wafuna. He's a Model UN coordinator, but he has worked at the UN as well and has been doing MUN for the best part of almost half a century. So great to have him here. We have Camille Sekeli, my good friend from Paris, who's been part of MUN also for many years, very active in the Paris scene, as well as crisis and interconnectivity, which is a rather new and innovative version of MUN. And Monteza joining us from Austria, I believe, today, if I'm not wrong. Yes. Who's also been involved in MUN across the Balkans and Europe, with also a lot of experience from crisis and every type of MUN you can imagine. So today's going to be very much a debate. For all of you watching, we will be grabbing your questions from YouTube and Facebook into the air meet. And from those of you on air meet, do ask your questions here, and we will discuss a bit about the 80 years that MUN has been running. It honestly surprises me when Bill first told me about the origins before the UN was even founded. I think that makes MUN very, very special, and I'm glad that today we can discuss it a bit more. So, Bill, over to you. Tell us a little bit about what MUN started as, where it went, and what it sort of appeared to be, I guess, before people like us got our hands on it.
Thank you very much, Philippe. It's my great pleasure to be here on this anniversary. Today is the actual 80th anniversary of the very first Model UN, which was created on March 18th. It was a three-day conference, March 18th to March 20th, 1943, by a group of students up at Hamilton College in upstate New York. I have been doing Model UN. My first Model UN was in 1970. So this is my 53rd year. This is pretty much all I do now that I've retired from the UN. I'm totally involved in organizing Model UN conferences around the world. I want to focus on three things in my introductory remarks, just briefly go over the origins of Model UN, how did it start, a little bit about what was simulated during the early history of Model UN, and then a little bit about the rules of procedure, how they've, what they were early on and how they've evolved during the early history. So the early history of Model UN, as I said, today is the 80th anniversary. How did it all start? One of the interesting questions is, why did a conference in 1943 refer to itself as a Model UN conference? How is that possible that 2 years before the UN was created, there was this Model UN conference? And the program, which I have, the cover of the program says Model UN Conference. How is that possible? Does anybody have any ideas? Did they have a crystal ball that they looked into and said, oh, in 2 years there's going to be something called the United Nations, and we're going to get a head start before everybody else? Does anybody have any ideas? How is that possible?
I don't know if I want to cheat here a little bit, but
No,
wasn't the UN Declaration drafted by 1942?
Wait a minute, don't give the answer away. Don't give the answer away. I want to see who knows, if anybody has any idea. No. Okay. So, January 1st, 1942, President Roosevelt coined this term United Nations. There's a very funny story about how it was created. But on January 1st, 1942, 26 countries signed what was called the United Nations Declaration, in which they pledged to continue in a united way, work together to defeat the Axis powers, which were Germany, Japan, and Italy. So the United Nations Declaration at that time referred to these 26 countries that had signed this declaration, that they would continue in a united way until they defeated the Axis powers. So as early as 1942, we find that United Nations Day was celebrated around the world. And over time, gradually, more and more countries signed the declaration. And eventually, when we get to 1945, there were eventually what's recognized as 51 countries established the UN. But in 1943, about 31 countries had signed the declaration. And there were these students, college students in upstate New York in Hamilton College, who had been simulating the League of Nations, which goes all the way back to the early 1920s. And they asked themselves this question: why are we simulating an entity which failed in its mission? Remember, the League of Nations was created in 1919 to prevent future world wars, and it failed in that mission. So why are we simulating something in 1943 while the Second World War was in full, in its around the world, and millions of people were being killed? They said, we need to change the focus of what we're doing. It makes no sense to be simulating this entity. So they said, let's focus our attention and simulate the 31 countries that have signed this declaration and create a conference where they would be discussing what needs to be done once the world war is over. Because by that time, if you remember, plans to create a new international entity had started as early as 1941. So thinking ahead to the future and to the creation of a new international organization had already started while the war was in motion. And so they were the first ones to do this. And after they did this, there was another conference at Vassar College that took place before 1945 as well. And they also referred to their conference as a Model UN conference. Once the UN was created, then we found more and more conferences being created that also referred to themselves as Model UN conferences, but this began as early as 1943. So it's very, very important date. Now, at the time, there was no General Assembly in 1943, so there were no entities that correspond to the structure of the UN today that they were actually simulating. It was really these 31 countries coming together, focusing on different aspects of what needed to be done once the war was over. When the UN was actually created, then we started seeing simulations occurring of actual bodies in the UN. Now, during much of the early history of the UN, simulations focused either on the General Assembly. Mostly, there were more simulations of the General Assembly than anything else, but there were also simulations of the Security Council from the very beginning as well. These usually happened apart. So usually you would have a simulation just of the General Assembly and a simulation just of the Security Council. But as time went on, eventually you would find these things occurring in one conference. But in the very early history of the UN, they were generally separate. You didn't find simulations of other UN entities. Eventually, by the time in the 1970s, I start to find simulations of ECOSOC. So it was very limited in terms of the number of entities that were simulated early on. You did find that the popularity of these simulations grew very rapidly. So in the very early history of Model UN, you found sometimes simulations of 1,000 students going to a conference, which is quite astounding, considering that this happened very quickly. So it was a very popular activity from early on. In terms of the rules of procedure, I have been collecting, because I'm writing a book on the history of Model UN, I have been collecting early records of conferences, including their rules of procedure. I have with me, for instance, I pulled out this, this, I guess it's not referred to as anything other than, it's something put out by the third annual Model General Assembly, which is a common word, and Security Council. So this was a conference in 1967 that was simulating both the General Assembly, and they referred to it as a Model General Assembly, and a Model Security Council at the same conference in 1967. And as a part of that, they published their rules of procedure. These are the rules of procedure of the General Assembly. They also have something similar for the Security Council. And I went through them to see how similar or different are they from the rules of procedure that are used today. And I found that the differences are quite extraordinary. They're very, very different from each other. I found that in 1967, that you didn't have the motions and points that are used today in Model UN. This stuck pretty closely to the rules of procedure, although it's not exactly the same, to the rules of procedure that were actually used by the General Assembly at that time. And I'll just read some of the sections. The duties of the president, the languages, what makes a quorum, the speakers list. There's a section on amendments, a section on reconsideration of proposals, amendments and closure of debate, suspension or adjournment of a meeting. These are all things from the actual General Assembly rules of procedure, order of procedural motions, voting procedures, the conduct of voting. And here's something very interesting at the end. They have a Rule 25, on parliamentary disputes. So here's, the insertion of the word parliamentary, which is not really correct because the UN is not a parliament. But what they had, and this is something that you find in early model UNs, is that if there were disputes, and I'll read this rule, when the decision of the president is not in agreement with the assembly on points of order, the dispute shall be submitted to the final decision of the parliamentarian. So if there were disputes about a particular rule, it would be submitted to a parliamentarian. And I found that this is a practice that was actually used in simulations of the League of Nations. So they took this over from simulations of the League of Nations and kept it when they were simulating in these early years the General Assembly. But in reality today, if there was a dispute between the president of the General Assembly and the Assembly itself, that dispute would be decided by putting it to a vote, and the members of the Assembly would actually decide on how to resolve that dispute. It would not be submitted to a parliamentarian. Today, if there is a question on a rule, they would call in somebody from the Office of Legal Affairs to advise the Assembly on a particular rule, but it would not be decided by a parliamentarian. But you'll notice in this list of rules of procedure, you don't have all of the motions and procedures that you find today in model UNs, and it's quite fascinating. Fast forward, so this is a simulation in Iowa by the University of Iowa. 7 years later, in Iowa, I found that they now had rules of procedure for the General Assembly, for Security Council, and for ECOSOC. And by 1974, I find for the first time a few of the motions that you see today. I found a reference to friendly amendments, which did not occur in earlier iterations of rules of procedure in Model UN. I found a reference to a point of information and a point of personal privilege. Those are the only things that I found that were similar to the rules of procedure today. So you see that there was some evolution over a period of 7 years to changes in the rule procedure that start to move a little bit more towards what we see today. But it was a very gradual change. In the very early years, it stuck very closely much more closely to the actual rules of procedure of the General Assembly. And then I also have in my records another simulation that started in 1953 in Geneva, a Model UN that thought that it was the very first Model UN in the world, which it was not, because they had no idea what was happening in other parts of the world. But I looked at their rules of procedure as well, and their rules of procedure have none of the points of motion that you use today. It had a point of order, you have the right of reply, but other than that, there isn't one motion of procedure. And this Model UN is still going on today in Geneva. So it started in 1953, still goes on today, and it had none of the motions or points that are used traditionally in Model UN today. So we find that the Model UN world was very different in the early years than we find today. And the other interesting thing is I've been trying to research and trace back something very common, which is moderated and unmoderated caucuses, which did not occur anywhere in the early Model UN. And the earliest so far I've been able to trace it back to is material published by UNA USA that goes back to the year 2000. There may be other instances prior to 2000. I have not yet been able to find them. But things that are very common today were not necessarily things that were used throughout the history of Model UN. The evolution was very gradual, and it's a fascinating and interesting thing that still needs a lot of research. One of the things that Model UN has moved towards is the use of parliamentary procedures, which are not used at the UN at all. So even though it has evolved in this direction, you must also be aware of the fact that these rules of procedure were never adopted by the real UN. None of the motions or points that are used in Model UN today are used at the except for one. Does anybody know the one point that is used at the real UN that's used in traditional Model UN? There is only one similarity, one point that's used in both. All of the others are not. There is one similarity. Does anybody know what it is?
Kemi, Amanda, do you want to give a guess? Is
Point of order.
Okay.
Is the only point that's used in the real UN and traditional Model UN. All of the others don't exist. So it's really important to understand that over time, Model UN has grown further and further away from the real UN.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I end my introductory remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. And I think that actually leads very clearly onto the debate, because if there's anything about MUN now, and I mean, Bill, we've also talked to the Global Department of Communication on this, it's that MUN doesn't really look like the UN in many other ways. I mean, Kemi, I want to go to you next. I mean, I remember in my head, for example, PyMUN, we had Harry Potter as a committee. We've had we've had almost the majority of some sessions not being about the UN itself. What can you say to the diversity of MUN nowadays? And do you think, obviously, is it good or bad thing, but do you think that's going to change or continue down that route?
I think the students, because most people who participate are students, they want to participate at MUNs also to have fun and not only to reproduce something that exists. And adding some twists allows delegates to participate in a high amount of conferences while not doing the same thing over and over again. At PyMan, we really, I've been working with PyMan since 2015, for 2015, 2022. And there really is that idea of keeping the basics, because we always keep them, but having other ways of living in MUN conference and developing the skills that you develop while doing MUNs. And so when I was Deputy Secretary General for the conference for PyMan 2018, we had actually three branches of the conference when it came to simulation and academics. We had the General Assembly branch that would be very much basic, Model UN, with, of course, different levels. Um, we had crisis, and we had interconnectivity. Interconnectivity, it would be several General Assembly committees, but working at the same time on the same topic, and the decisions from one committee will impact the others. Whereas crisis, um, it's a very broad word to talk about kind of the others. So, crisis would be defined by the fact that you are having information dropped to you um, by or the chairs or a backroom, but not from the delegates. So you don't only have the input of study guide, but you have inputs toward like during the conference. And that can be represented in historical crisis, which is, I think, the most used one, usually double or triple joints, which means the number of cabinets you work with. Um, you can also have fictional crisis. So you're naming Harry Potter, for instance. I also was a delegate at a conference where we did a Game of Thrones uh, simulation. So you can have a lot of teams, and for our and I remember also there was a conference with the Marvel team. So
Yes.
really different themes possible there. And of course, you have what I call the futuristic slash other types of crisis. So, for instance, I did one on the rising level of war in the world.
Mm.
You also have another type, which is a hybrid between crisis and general assembly, which is something I called news update committee, where it's a general assembly committee, but with the chairs giving out news updates to create elements of crisis, but without it being a full on crisis. You still have a big topic to talk about and resolutions to vote for. So this is the different types of MUNs that you have today in Europe.
Mhm.
You also have MUs that are not simulation of United Nations, but of the European Union instances, most often Parliament and the ministers, the
Council.
the EU Council, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how it is when it comes to how diverse it is. And it's actually very great because all parts are being open more and more. When I started, MUN's crisis was something that you could only do when you were advanced and you knew people that were already in crisis committees. Whereas now it's a bit more open. And that idea of having to be very experienced to move through crisis is, I think, dying out, which is good, because you can enjoy crisis comedies only. You can enjoy a variety of comedies, and it really makes it possible to adapt your way of doing MUNs to different types of work that you can do.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, that really speaks to, I think, how you have a lot of, it's very grassroots now, which I think obviously it wasn't, not that it wasn't grassroots before, Bill, back in the US, but there's a lot of, I think, local cultural sort of changes that now go into MUN that maybe were less prevalent because it's more focused on the UN. I want to quickly
And
go to Amanda here. Oh, sorry, Cami, you want to say something
yeah,
else?
and there's just one other aspect. It's that now you have more and more conferences, and you need to be
Mm,
an attractive conference to have enough delegates to make it enjoyable. And so, using those strategies of committees can allow you to have different types of people come to your conference, and therefore more people as well.
mhm, mhm.
Just one thing I want to quickly add that we have, in terms of future, you mentioned futuristic simulations. One thing that we have started, there are a number of think tanks that are making proposals to the UN on new entities that they are encouraging the UN to create. And we have started engaging in creating simulations. We call them futuristic simulations of entities that don't have not yet been created by the UN, but might be created sometime in the future, to sort of see what would they look like if they actually existed. So that's another kind of futuristic simulation that could be done that we're engaging in our conferences.
That's interesting to hear. I don't think, we don't have that as much in Europe, but I think that definitely there's aspects to it. So Amanda, I want to come to you, and I think that you and Kemi share, I think, a lot of that background of crisis and also MEU. And I know, Kemi, you have this experience of organizing as well, but Amanda, you do as well. Is there anything to sort of add, especially in terms of how do you even approach developing an MUN nowadays? Do you think that's changed quite significantly?
Well, first of all, I think I'll pick up where Camille left off. It's the amount of simulations that are available at the moment that really pushes you to do more, to do better, to be different. So it's not just about MUN anymore, which can be a huge challenge, and it can be a very big opportunity as well. So what we always try to do at Salient in Ljubljana, our home conference, was that we kind of try to create always an overarching theme that might be interesting for people joining, and also picked ourselves already the topics for the committees. So it wasn't always up to the chairs, but we kind of tried to join the MUN with the actual content conference, working ahead of time, like a few months in advance, to actually secure panelists, speakers, professors who would come and do the inputs on these topics, because we believe that adds an extra layer to the MUN simulation. So it was a kind of in-depth summer school that also featured MUN, and that format worked for us for a very long time. But then it stopped as well. So, how do you adapt to, something was a safe model for such a long time, and then just not attracting people anymore? So you had to change something, right? And then we started doing much more crisis oriented simulations, but we did differently. Like, we also founded our own approach, which was kind of way less interactive crisis. There was more input from the crisis directors of actual scenarios written, and delegates were limited in what they could do themselves. And that worked for a very long time, but then that also requires new people who are willing to do that, because it takes a lot of effort. And right now, Salient is much different than what it used to be 10 years ago, right? Because also the populations are changing, the students are changing, and the demands are changing. And I think the biggest challenge that we're facing now is the post-COVID era, where online conferences became a trend. They were much more accessible because, well, they were free. Much more students could join in. You didn't have the usual, visa issues and, the flight tickets. And it was much more, let's say, global, much more connecting. And how do you now translate that online dimension into in-person conference? It's another challenge. How do you attract people back into classrooms when before you opened a whole new dimension of, having people from all around the world in the same room present at the same all the time? So I think even in the last 10 years, MUN and how to organize a conference changed a lot. So I think every year we have to adapt quite rapidly to new changes and new demands from the students.
It's very good. I want to pick up on a point you mentioned and ask the Bill, the composition of the people at MUN. Nowadays, I think it's very much seen as it's an internationalist hub. Almost you find in any city that's an MUN, the people there are usually the most international. Very different backgrounds, very different countries. It's a way that I managed to meet internationalists like Camille and also many other people across my life. And maybe Bill, what were some of the compositions of people who came to MUN at the beginning? Was it always just from that uni, just from that city, just from that country? Or do you find quite international conferences still?
Well, in the very beginning, you didn't have international conferences at all.
Of course. Yeah.
It was very much centered in the United States. Again, you started from 1953 on. You had conferences starting in Europe, but prior to that, it was very much localized in the United States, and you had regions with everything was in regions. So, for instance, you had East Coast conferences happening, so it wasn't necessarily localized in a city, but you had a region. You had the West Coast region, you had the Midwest region, so things were regional in that sense early on. They which accounted for the fact of these conferences being fairly large. Some of them were between 1,000 and 1,500 students for one conference, and that came from the fact that they were a lot of them were regional in nature. But the international component really didn't happen till much later.
The first, if I'm not wrong, was, I think The Hague was one of the first in Europe, and then I think Indonesia spread from that.
1950.
Geneva, of course, yeah, Geneva.
Geneva was the first one in 1953.
Mm-hmm. I didn't see them celebrating their 70th anniversary. I hope they do that this year.
Yeah.
There's a question we had about sort of what encouraged you to be at MUN. I want to pick that up and run with it, kind of, and look at, why do you think people went to MUN in the past and why do they do it now? I want to ask Camille and Amanda maybe to begin with. Why do you think people do MUN now? What are some of the reasons that either you would tell someone to go to MUN or you think people do apply for them? And I'll take both of you if I can. Maybe Camille, you want to first of the reasons. Why did you do it? And why do you think people will come to them now?
I did because I had no friends.
It's a way of socializing, there's no doubt.
Honestly, when the university system in France is very particular because it's huge universities. Like, you have tens of thousands of students sometimes in the same campus, and your classes are huge. I was in class with, we were 800 people. It was huge. It's super difficult to make friends. And it was, at first, my goal was like, I'm going to go meet new people. And then I got hooked by the fact that I was learning new stuff, because when you research a conference, you just learn, and you increase your capacity of learning and doing research well, which is very useful. And as well, during the conference and or trainings, you are practicing theory that you're learning in class. And I felt that it was really helping me academically, but also for my future, as when I would go into the work world, because it allows you to make mistakes and they don't matter, because the conference ends in a week. So you can make mistakes over and over again and learn from them and try everything. Try how you want to socialize professionally. Maybe I'm going to try being the funny one and make jokes. And it doesn't work because you end up not being funny. Ahem. And then you go like, oh, maybe I can just chat with people, and you meet different types of people and you work with different people as well. So yeah, that's why I recommend it, because it's so versatile in everything you learn. And even if you don't like it, do one conference. Just that, it will help you grow a lot.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Amanda, would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Like, MUN has been one of the best experiences that I've, had in my life. And I started actually because my mom forced me to do it. In my first year of studies, like, there was this introduction session. Some students came to talk to us during English, and then I came home. My mom made me lunch, and I explained what happened. And I was like, maybe I will join in a year or two. And she's like, no, you will join now because you need to. I was like Camille said, new friends, new opportunities, mingling. Interacting with people, and it helped also my English tremendously. Like, my first conference, oh my god, I remember I made the opening speech and I would never open my mouth again, and now I can talk for hours. And I think that I owe that to MUN, because I think the school system in Slovenia didn't teach me that. And definitely I agree. Like, also, it's MUN provided depth to the knowledge that I got in classrooms, because there was never time to analyze conflicts in depth, right? And preparing for an MUN conference gives you that. Being a chair, writing a study guide, or just, interacting with other delegates makes you understand the different layers and nuances of a conflict. And if you are, interested in international relations, politics, geopolitics, this is something that's, at least for me, I think I lacked in traditional academia. And in the end, it is about also a circle of friends and acquaintances that I have now all around the world. That makes it also super useful for the professional life. I never expected to get a job out of MUN, and I still don't, but the fingers crossed.
I got an internship out of it.
Well, yeah, the things that I do now kind of are similar to that, right? But in most of the things that I hope to do also in the future, they're going to be very internationally oriented. And I already have a base of 100 friends around the world, which I can connect with, hoping to pursue these ideas further. So I think that is the biggest takeout of MUN.
Just to maybe answer one of your previous questions, Amanda, and just one way Paiman works to attract people is to play on that social card. That's why you have so many socials during the conference. And like the conference is expensive because you have many socials, because we really emphasize on breaks allow you to network, and socials, like parties as well. And it's a good way to make it. You have to be there to live that. You cannot do it from a computer.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, maybe on my own experience, I think that I also joined similar to you, Amanda. You know, I went to the fair, I got involved in the debating, and I wouldn't be where I am without it. And I mean, I want to add maybe a perspective from regions that's not represented here, but for example, in Asia, I think there's quite a lot of emphasis is put on the sort of career side of it and the prestige side of it. They don't get many chances to speak English in a professional environment, and that's very useful. And there's also these sort of big set piece, prestigious opening closing ceremonies. They're a lot more intense in Asia than I found in the US or Europe or Africa. And I think that's usually something they put a lot of emphasis on there. And, you know, in India, for example, there's money and scholarships riding on MUN, big money sometimes. And I find that very fascinating, that's probably something that wasn't around in the beginning. And maybe Bill, back to you on that. I mean, did you find that there was a particular reason people went? I know that in the US, for example, unlike many countries who do MUN, there's credits tied to MUN, and students usually go also to study it. Did you find that was the case at the beginning? And maybe a personal reflection yourself. Why did you join? And were there also socials when you started MUN?
I'm sorry, the last thing, were there what?
Socials. Was there also a sort of social activity at MUN, or is there something that came a bit later, you think?
I don't remember the socials. I don't.
Maybe that means they were good socials.
I mean, I joined because it was a popular activity in our high school, and it was we had organized in 1970. Our high school had hosted what's called ECMUNC, which still exists today. It's a Model UN for the East Coast of the United States. So we had students from all around the East Coast come to our high school. And, you know, as everyone is saying, you know, meeting people from different places is one of the things which is so exciting about Model UN. And these friendships last a lifetime. So being involved in something like that, it engaged our entire school because we were hosting all of these students from all over the world, not the world, I'm sorry, all over the East Coast. And the other thing is that, you know, the students were staying in the homes of other students, so you got to really get to know people in a different kind of way. So the whole social aspect was something that's attractive. It was attractive even back then.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think people started doing MUNs in the beginning of it? Was it also, I mean, obviously you mentioned it was sort of started from high school as well. Was it still this kind of high school aspect? Was credits or teaching for MUN around in those early days?
I don't remember anything dealing with credits during the early days. So that must have come later. What was your other question? I'm sorry.
That was, you know, why would people have done it to begin with? Is it just this new novel UN idea? Let's see how it works.
I think there were two things. I think it engaged people intellectually to be involved in discussing international affairs that we would read about in the news. So there was an intellectual aspect, and it was traditionally the students that were the more academically oriented that were drawn to this kind of activity. So that was also an aspect that I think drew people into it. Besides the social aspect.
Great. We've got about another 15 minutes. I want to turn our mind to the future of MUN. Now, I'm not saying 80 years. That's a bit hard to predict. But as trends go, more and more people are going to be doing MUN as COVID restrictions are now lifted everywhere. Although I myself am in COVID isolation, I might add. More MUNs and more ways of doing MUNs are going to get out there. What do people think are the aspects that might change the most? I might want to go to you,
if I could just start off with that. So, two things that I see happening that are still really at the beginning stages. I don't know how much they will expand. One of them is to engage. There are some model UNs that are happening now that are targeting adults that are no longer studying. They're much older. They may have done model UN when they were younger, but as a way of engaging them in the work of the UN. So that's something which is very interesting and I think has a lot of promise as well. And I see model UN, there's been a push for quite a while for, so what we go to these conferences, we adopt resolutions, and then what? And I think there's been a real thirst and interest in being more involved and having more voice in the decision-making process in the international. And we see many changes in the UN. There's the UN just adopted a resolution creating the UN Youth Office. And we find, for instance, we're working with the WHO now, and we did our first conference with them, and they want to bring these resolutions and present them to member states. So there's a movement more towards making this more than just a simulation, and also giving youth an opportunity to have a real voice in the decision-making process. But more than that, we see pushes for something. You look at things like MUN Impact. We're beyond model UN. Delegates are going back into their communities, and they want to do things and develop projects that are really making an impact, particularly in the SDGs and helping to achieve the SDGs. So I think that one of the ways in which this is growing is to expand model UN beyond just simulations and evolving it into real community activism.
That's a really, really great point. Amanda, over to you on this. Where do you think MUN's kind of going? And do you see any of this aspect evolving in Europe?
Yeah, I think so. I would continue actually where Bill left off. I think what is now a trend, or I believe it's going to also become in the future, is joining MUNs with activism. It is debating the futuristic topics that may become a reality very soon. So that's, already mentioned, the rising water levels, scarcity of drinkable water, space is a whole new topic that is becoming more and more popular. So I think through MUN, we might start exploring also the topics that are touching our reality, are going to be our future. Raising awareness, joining it together with activism, and actually making it more conscious. Because sometimes in the past years, we have also observed that some of the most prominent conflicts that are happening are sometimes rather not debated in MUNs because it's too scary to kind of touch upon that. And I think in the future, already observing the trends now, I think these futuristic topics that are going to be the major problems of humanity are going to be also ever present. And the sooner we start doing that, the better, because, we have to make it conscious what is actually happening around us and what is going to be the future of the world.
Very, very good point. I think just the amount of climate change I think we discussed in MUN is very evocable of that. And I also want to bring in the fact that, the UN, I think it's UNHCR who had their sort of their MUN challenge where you discussed sort of migration in MUN, and that was something they publicized quite effectively. We might see more of that. Camille, same sort of question to you. Where do you see MUN going, or would you like it to as well?
I'm gonna have a very similar answer from Amanda, but more on a organizing side, because for the past years I've been more organizing MUNs than actually going there. And I was gonna say having more politicized conferences, but to a certain level. Anecdote, one of the years I was working for Paimon, it was presidential election in France, and the secretary general at the time asked if we could be affiliated to one of the candidates. Everyone refused because, like, no way. And that, I think, will be the extreme that conferences won't go to, because that would be a bit too much. But I'm seeing more and more politicized conferences, and conferences actually making a statement by how they're organizing themselves. Um, for instance, PyMon 2022, that was supposed to be 2020, but we know why. It was organized by two women, and you could really feel how important being safe during the conference was relevant to how they organized it. During socials, you had a safe space dedicated. You had a cocktail you could order, a drink that you could order that would immediately trigger and like watch out alarm. Um, there was really when there were issues, what happened, the secretariat really took a step in and even kicked some people from the conference because they wouldn't abide from of the rules. um and it was very progressive for an MUN to be like that. Maybe not for people who are new to MUNs, but in 2015 when I started, MUNs were a very toxic place and non-inclusive one. And I see more and more conferences being inclusive in the way they're organizing their conference and also in the topics they're choosing, way more politically engaged, especially about climate change. And we can see more and more comedies that are UN women, which is not really a UN comedy, but whatever. It doesn't work the same way, but it's model, it's fine. And so and you can see more and more topics being pushed that could be considered political, but that are good to have discussions about. And I think that's how it's gonna go, is that when you're going to organize an MUN conference, you're not just gonna be organizing an academical project, but it's actually a step up and a human question as well. Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with very young people that are very often 21 and under, which is very, very young. Let's be honest here. Um, I can talk. I'm so old. I'm 26. And but yeah, like, you're a kid, and as someone who organizes conferences, you have a responsibility, and as someone who attends those conferences, you have also a responsibility. And I feel like that level of responsibility coming with the MUN world is being more and more striking in how conferences are organized nowadays, and I think in the future.
One of the things, Philippe, that we have not mentioned is the fact that Model UN has expanded, where it starts in elementary school and it goes all the way through graduate
Yeah.
school. And so it's really becoming lifespan. As I said, I'm starting
Mhm.
to see Model UN conferences for adults who are much older. So it really goes from, elementary school all the way up through adults, and that's a huge change. When Model UN was really targeted to high school and university, now it's lifespan.
I think that's probably because Model UN is a learning tool. More than anything, it is a learning tool, both for the soft skills and also the research about the UN. I think we tried to sold a bill also a lot as the most successful tool to learn about the UN. And what's become more prevalent just in society is this concept of lifelong learning. That you can always learn new skills and new ideas, and as MUN diversifies, so can what people learn from it, what we can learn from it, and how it presents itself. So we haven't got much left, and I do want to give time to the interactive resolution. Maybe just sort of a final question. Feel free to reflect a bit on this. What is one thing that you are most excited to see going forward in MUN, that you're really happy and excited to see, and one thing you would immediately change now from how MUN is organized or presented? So one thing you're really excited and looking forward to in MUN, and one thing you think you'd really love to change right now about it. I can give you a few seconds on that, and I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll start.
Go for it, Bill.
Well, I think it's clear that we're becoming a much more interconnected world, and the fact that technology and the easiness with which we can travel to different places is making it possible for people to interact in a way that they've never been able to do so before. For me, traveling around the world doing Model UNs, it's changed my life. And if more people were able to do that, I think we would have a more peaceful world, because getting to understand other cultures and different ways of thinking, brings us outside of our own narrow focus when we don't do those kinds of things. And we see all kinds of, in the United States, for instance, many people don't have passports. They've never traveled, and they don't really interact with other people that think differently. So that excites me. What I would like to change, one of the things that I think has been missing from Model UN is that traditional Model UN, all of the decisions are made by voting. The real UN started moving away from voting in the 1950s, where today the great majority of decisions throughout the UN system are made without taking a vote. It's made through this consensus approach, which is the negotiation process to reach consensus is drastically different and a completely different mindset from making decisions by voting. I would like more people to experience the consensus process and the negotiation process that's different, because I really feel it's the foundation of developing the culture of peace. Because in the negotiation process, which aims to reach consensus, you really have to listen carefully to other people that think differently from you. When you make decisions by voting, you only need a simple majority, and then you can go on to the next resolution. You can ignore as much as 49% of other differences of opinions. You don't have to engage in a direct negotiation with them. So what I would like to see is I'd like to see more students experience the negotiation process, which aims towards consensus, because I really think it has a great deal of value in building a culture of peace.
That's a really good point, Bill. My first MUN was also consensus as well, so I can agree it's a very different experience and a very positive one. Maybe Amanda, and then we can end on Camille.
So what I started to look forward to in MUNs more and more now are the memes. I think the meme board in MUN has developed quite a lot in the recent years, and I am quite excited about that second, more informal part of it, because I think it also brings a whole new culture to it. And I think that I would change. As you know, I have green hair myself, and that's also sometimes not seen as the most, appropriate for the fancy attire we're trying to pursue at MUNs. And there have been questions rising that, also having 6 separate outfits for a whole, different days of sessions that are kind of business casual is something that may pose a challenge to certain students. So in that sense, MUN can be sort of, how to say, inaccessible or elitist even, while it is still a student fun conference. So what I would like to see more is a little bit more flexibility when it comes to what is appropriate attire, because that's also changing in the world that we're seeing now. So I hope that MUN doesn't stay the most rigid of the forums, where also people with green hair can be something that's appropriate, let's say. Yeah, that's my hope for the future.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Richard Dawkins coined the word meme to mean a cultural idea that moves throughout society, and I've absolutely, both in the sort of fun social way and the real way, I really do think MUN's getting a lot better in that. That's a really, really good point. And maybe last but not least, Camille.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm having allergies a lot, so don't mind me. It's just the
It's okay.
too
I
nice
understand the
weather.
emotion of talking about
Bring me
MUN,
back to winter,
but
please.
yeah, exactly.
What I'm excited the most. Oh, I'm going to sound so cheesy. Sorry. Really, I think I'm crying for that. It's actually the people that are on this call and the people that are going to make the next generation of MUNers, because there's pre-COVID, like post-COVID, after COVID, and I really have lots of hope for that generation. I still coach sometimes at the Sorbonne Association, MUN Association, and like, you guys are good. I'm shocked. Like, the level is not the same as when I started. So Really, I'm most excited for that. And what I wish would be more something that I wish for from the start is that more people knew about MUN, because I
Mhm.
feel like to many people it's something that is super niche, super bougie, super difficult. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's just like playing Dungeon and Dragons, but on school hours. So it's very fun and it should be marketed as way more accessible, because I think that if more people would join conferences, first they'll be less expensive, so more accessible to more people. I've seen it because I've done budgets for 600 people and 800 people, and the difference in delegate fees is crazy for the same content. And yeah, overall I really hope more people will get to know MUNs and take the leap of faith of doing MUNs, and even if they don't like it, it's fine. And that more people would try out new stuff, because that's how it grows. And like people who do MUN to try MUs or any other types of simulations, and vice versa. So yeah, that would be my wish. More people.
Well, I think that will be a wish come true, and I hope all of the ideas for MES will come true. Thank you very much, Gami, Amanda, and Bill, for joining us today, discussing really kind of the topic at the heart of this summit: 80 years of MUN. What does that mean for MUN? Where is it going? I think this is a really positive kind of discussion, and I'm really, really happy with that. And I have no doubt we'll be following it up. And I think all of your points are a big part of why MUNers Cross Borders exists, why these debates exist. And I really hope we can bring that more to everyone, not just here on the call, not just streaming it, watching the videos, but really everyone who has a chance to do MUN. So thank you very much, and have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
evening.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.